Our world, it keeps changing. Even words change meaning over time. Ideas change. Lots of things change. Things that may have seemed to be perfectly acceptable and maybe even good manners change over time. And sometimes it's a societal change. Sometimes it's kind of like a realization that what was going on maybe wasn't the right thing. And I think God is at work in this, pulling us closer to that good that only God can express. And I'm not saying that, we humans are getting more holy. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that God takes us and kind of pulls us forward. Now, it doesn't seem like a straight path. Our roller coaster of life in this world seems to be, things are getting better, and then they're getting worse, and then they're getting worse, and then they get worse, and then they get a little better and maybe get worse again. But I do agree with the phrase that was made popular by Dr. Martin Luther King, that the arc of the universe, the moral arc of the universe, is a long one, but it does bend toward justice. And I think God's calling us to that justice. So let me give you one extreme example that I shared in communion. We were talking about, not in communion, but in confirmation, we were talking about baptism and the Lord's Supper. And we were talking about how this denomination believes, this kind of thing about baptism. And they do baptism either when they're young or they're older. And this denomination believes this about the Lord's Supper. And there's differences. Now, I also pointed out that less than 1,000 years ago, if you had differences in this, in some areas, you killed each other. Thankfully, we just yell at each other over social media about these things these days. So that's an example of some improvement. Okay? So God is going to call people forward in justice and mercy, and we're going to consider that in this gospel lesson for today. So the first part of the gospel lesson has Jesus talking about the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were concerned with the ritual laws. They were concerned that, you have to wash the dish properly in the proper way. You have to eat the right food. And Jesus is saying, you got the emphasis on the wrong part. Because it's not the food that goes through. He makes some pretty graphic examples of what's going to happen to food. But he also says the important thing is what comes out of the body, the words, the thoughts that come out of the body. That is where the emphasis should be. Now, after that, Matthew, after those words with the Pharisees, Matthew tells us that Jesus is moving from that area, which is probably near the temple area or near a synagogue, to the area of Tyre and Sidon. Now, why that's significant is Jesus is moving from an area that is primarily Jewish to an area that's not primarily Jewish, to an area that's got Gentiles in it. So, in this area, the disciples are following Jesus, and this woman shows up in Tyre and Sidon, and she's classified as a Canaanite woman. Okay? Now, Matthew doesn't use the word Canaanite very often. Actually, this is the only place he uses it. Canaanite could mean a few different things. It could simply mean non-Jew. The Jewish people had a lot of terms for people that weren't Jews. Greeks, Gentiles, Canaanites, could have just meant that. It could have meant one of the descendants of people that the Israelites kicked out at one point in time that stuck around, so it could have a little bit of a derogatory feel. It could also be a reference to some pretty important Canaanite women in Israelite history. You have Tamar, who was a Canaanite woman who showed up Judah to be a little morally bankrupt. We have Rahab, the woman who was inside the promised land that helped the Israelites take over. So it could be references to those. And I kind of like those references because we're going to see in just a minute what a significant movement in the gospel that this Canaanite woman marks. But some other things, we don't know this woman's name. We don't know her history. All we know is she was a Canaanite woman in the area of Tyre and Sidon. So a lot of things we've got to, either imply or other people have said in commentary. So there's a lot of ideas about what's happening with this Canaanite woman. And there's ideas about how she was viewed by the Jewish people, especially the disciples around her. So here's how the story's going. The woman was shouting, and Jesus didn't answer. But the disciples came up to her and said, "This woman is annoying. Send her away." Jesus does neither. But the woman keeps shouting, and eventually she falls down in front of Jesus and pleads with him. But then we see Jesus acting and saying things that just seem a little un-Jesus, if you know what I mean. Okay? They seem a little out of place, to say the least. And this, as people of the gospel, this causes us some problems. And there's been different ways to deal with this over time. So here we're going to go on a little bit of a diversion to talk about, some ways that we can deal with Jesus saying these words about this Canaanite woman, referring to her as a dog. Okay? Because that just doesn't sound pleasant to our ears. So there's a couple ideas about this that commentators think and have talked about. So I don't want you to get stuck on these ideas, but I just want to show you the different ideas, because we're going to get to the end of this gospel and show that no matter which of these ideas might be true or none of them, there's still something amazing happening here. So one of the ideas is that people suggest that, Jesus referred to her as not a dog, but a little doggy, and it was kind of a nice term. Most people don't buy that, but that was one of the commentators. Other people say, wow, this is the mark in Jesus' life and ministry where Jesus himself had a transformation. Now, we could go along that part, but we've got to have, probably 3 more sermons about how this works with sin and things, so we're going to leave that aside as well. We could also say that Jesus knew the woman's heart, and he was just pulling her along. Okay? The one I kind of like is that Jesus was doing this not just for the Canaanite woman, but for the people who were hearing him, for his disciples and the people surrounding him. So we have to find ways to work with this behavior, but the one I like is that the Canaanite woman was part of a bigger message. Because if we go back to this, the interaction, the drama that's happening, we have the Canaanite woman not backing away. At each point in this interaction, she interacts with Jesus. When she doesn't get a response, she keeps going. She just intensifies a little bit. She kneels down in front of Jesus and says, "Here I am. Here I am." And when Jesus says, "Sorry, you're not part of my mission, because it's not right to take what's for the children of Israel and give it to the dogs." And she's like, oh. So does not walk away offended, does not challenge Jesus, but actually just plays along, goes along with it and said, yes, but even the dogs get the scraps from the table. Even the dogs. And Jesus responds by telling her that her faith is great. And as we go through the gospel, Jesus tells some people that their faith is great. And it's usually the ones that are not expected to hear such things. And the Canaanite woman is another example of that. But I want to focus on what people may have thought. So you've got the disciples, and their first thought is, let's get this woman out of here. Okay, this is not part of our mission. And up until the point where she kneels in front of Jesus, and Jesus tells her, not part of our mission. I'm here for the lost children of Israel. I want you to stop for a moment and think about what maybe the disciples and the people surrounding Jesus were thinking. Were they thinking, whoa, this is not what should be happening? I don't think so. I think they were thinking, this is the way things always were. This is the way things are always going to be. The Canaanites and the Israelites are going to be separate. The promise of God is only for the Jews. And they were thinking, this is exactly how it's supposed to go down. This woman is going to go away, and we're going to continue on this mission to the Jewish people. But that is not what happens. That is not what happens. Because what I think is happening here, what I see, what I think we can look at is this Canaanite woman had now become a collaborator with Jesus. She had now been part of the big mission, a catalyst to expand the gospel. Because at this moment, it was not just the children of Israel. Now the gospel was being expanded to everyone in Jesus' mission. It was growing. It was taking something that people thought is always going to be the way it is, and then it gets disrupted. Then it gets changed. And that Canaanite woman was part of the plan, part of the mission of Christ to expand the gospel, and it happened in a way that surprised the people around there, I believe. It happened in a way that they didn't expect. It happened in a way that they thought, oh no, this is the way things always have to be. But Jesus and his collaborator, they changed everything. They changed everything. Now, that kingdom expanded. And I'm going to say that the kingdom is still expanding. The kingdom of God. But I'm going to say it needs to expand some more. It needs to expand some more. Because there are some parts of our society, there are some people in our world that believe that, things are always going to be this way. It's always going to be that the black people live over there, and the brown people live over there, and the white people live over there, and that's the way it's always going to be. There are people that think that it is always going to be okay to deny the painful history of another group. There are going to be people that think that it's just always going to be okay because that's the way it was, that poor people are going to remain poor. There are people that say it's always going to be that way, that we are going to have words that hurt people, but people are just going to still use them because that's the way it's always going to be. But I'm telling you, there are some collaborators out there. There are some collaborators that are working with Jesus in places that we don't expect. There are collaborators in the poor and oppressed areas that are just waiting to be shown for us to see the miracles that they are working on with Jesus. There are collaborators that are showing the light of things that the whole world needs to see. Because even though we may say, that is just the way it always is. Even if people say that is the way it always is, it's not going to change. Jesus doesn't accept that. No, when you tell God, that's just all the way it is, God says, no, that's not the way it's going to be. Because I got a plan for something better. I got a plan for something bigger. And the question I'm going to ask is, Are you going to be a collaborator with Jesus? Are you going to join the movement to shake up the world and share the overwhelming love and forgiveness that only can be gathered through Christ? Are you going to let God choose you as God's collaborator?